Okay, just so we have it ready to rock and roll. I'm sorry, Barbara, you know I always interrupt you. I apologize for that.
That's all right. Thanks, Debbie. Our presentation today will be recorded and kept for 30 days. You will get a link. All active members will get a link in a few days to the recorded session. Please open your chat window so that you can ask questions during our presentation, and please keep your microphones muted. If you have a brick wall question, please stay after the meeting so that interested TJGS members can help you. Please put those questions in the chat now or whenever they occur to you during the talk. Our guest presenter today is Aaron Ginsburg. He first reunited a family separated by the Holocaust in 2007. In addition to the Shoah families that may be separated by the passage of time or by geography, families are often unaware that they had relatives on the other side of the Atlantic. American families are often less connected to the past, while on the Russian side, families are obsessed by the stories that they could not share before the breakup of the Soviet Union. Using multiple examples, Aaron will demonstrate the process and will share the excitement at the moment of discovery. And speaking of the moment of discovery, Norma, if you would put up that picture that I sent you, because I had an experience like this. There we are. So these folks in this picture, you'll see me on the bottom left, and all of us are related. Our grandmothers were sisters. My grandmother left Russia in 1907 and came to Philadelphia, and she left 4 sisters and a brother. And after 1939, she corresponded with them quite often, but after 1939, she didn't hear anything from them. And the area in Belarus where they were from was one of those towns where the Nazis lined people up in front of a ditch and shot them, and that was it. So everyone in Philadelphia assumed that all of the sisters had been murdered. In 2017, for some reason, I decided to Google my great-grandmother's name. I happened to know both her maiden name and her married name. And I got a hit on a Genie.com family that said, the person who had put the information in said her great-grandmother was Perla Abalov Wilson, which was my great-grandmother. And I communicated with the person who had put the family on Genie, and lo and behold, all of the people in this picture beside me, they're all in Buffalo, New York. The family survived the Holocaust by going to Siberia. They came back to Belarus after the war. And in the late 80s and early 90s, they left the Soviet Union and came to the United States. And Lena, my cousin who's sitting next to me, was a physician in Minsk. And she came to Buffalo and got her internal medicine accreditation and just retired as an internist. The 2 men on either side, on the left and the right, are her brothers. I actually have a better DNA connection with one of the brothers than with Lena herself. And then the man in the middle is another cousin, and his grandmother was a sister to the others, but his parents were first cousins. He has never had DNA testing, but boy, I would love to see how it would come out, because I think it would probably be except for a sibling, it would be the closest relation that I have. Anyway, we couldn't believe it. We didn't know the other even existed. So that's the kind of story that I hope Aaron is going to tell us about. Go ahead.
Are we ready?
Yes.
Oh, Barbara, which town in Belarus?
Rogachev. I still get chills. I've got chills right now when I talk about it.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. Before we get started, I think we need to fix something about this particular slide. I think the proportions are all wrong. And it should look like this.
Yes, yes.
I'm going to use a lot of techniques. So this is a list of many of the things that we will use in the examples that I give. So our first example is the family of Nahum Ginsburg. Now, Ginsburg is a very common name, and this is not about my family. I'm registered with the jewishgen.org Family Finder as being interested in Ginsburg from Parfyanova in Belarus. Of course, if you put your name there, it's like dropping a note in a bottle and dropping the bottle into the ocean. You never know where or when or who's going to find it. In 2004, I received this long and detailed message from a woman named Ina who lives in Israel. Could I help her find her a Ginsburg family, which was from Vitebsk? At the time, I wasn't the person I am now. And I said no. I told her I only knew about my own Ginsburg family, and that was the end of the conversation. But actually, it wasn't the end of the story. I stumbled on the message in 2011 when I was looking for a message from my then wife, Ina. I save all my messages, and I suggest that you do the same. But I looked at the message with new eyes. There were very specific facts and in the message. So Berka Ginsburg was married to Ida, who died in Vitebsk in 1939. They had at least 2 children, Nahum and Malka. Nahum married the daughter of an engineer at Siemens in St. Petersburg. They had 2 children, and Nahum and his family went to London after the Bolshevik Revolution. And Malka was the grandmother of Ina. Well, I did a quick search on Google just to see what would happen. I put the search in quotation marks to try for the exact, that way I could look for the exact spelling. There were a few hits, but I was in such a hurry, I missed them. I guess I needed new glasses, which is not unusual for me. At the time, I lived in Natick, Massachusetts, so I went to the public library and used Ancestry.com. I remember that day very well because there was a severe storm warning, and Massachusetts had 3 tornadoes on that day, which was kind of exciting. They didn't quite reach Natick, though. So I searched for Nahum Ginsburg, and I got a hit. I found on Ancestry.com, which I didn't subscribe to at the time, a record of Nahum Ginsburg's death in 1944. And he appeared to be living in London. So that confirmed the spelling of his first name. I went back and did the same search on Google. And now I looked more carefully at the links I had ignored. There were 3 obituaries for his daughter, Jean Ginsburg. Jean was the daughter of newly arrived Jewish political refugees from revolutionary Russia. Before the revolution, her father, Nahum Ginsburg, had sheltered Trotsky in his home in St. Petersburg when he was on the run from Tsarist troops. He was in prison for this. Her mother, Anya, with a purse full of money, went to a Bolshevik general and got her husband freed. Later, they fled to London, arriving in 1921. The foundation has been established in her memory and will fund scholarships in music and medicine. I got to tell you, I love obituaries that contained everything but the kitchen sink. and this was one of them. Dr. Jean Ginsburg was a prominent English physician who helped introduce the pill to England. I assume everybody know what the pill is talking about. Had a lot of different pills since then. The British Medical Journal obituary had a link to the Jean Ginsburg Memorial Foundation's website, which included an email address and the names of her children. Although this started in 2004, when I got to this in 2011, it took less than an hour to get to this point. So when I get to this point, I knew I was about to be in contact with Jean Ginsburg's family. So I sent a message to Ina N to make sure she still had the same email address as she had in 2004. She replied right away. So we're looking at a picture of Jean and the Jean Ginsburg Memorial Foundation, which had a memorial concert with the awards to go to people who were pursuing a career in classical music, in medicine, or to train as a classical pianist. And that concert was in January 2007. So I sent a message to the foundation. Jean's daughter replied. Her mother had told her about her family history while they were in the waiting room in the Florence, Italy train station. She told me that her grandfather, Naum, had sent a message to the Red Cross, using the Red Cross, to Russia before he died in 1944 to find out what happened to his relatives. There was no reply. Ina checked with her relatives that were still in Russia. Ina was in Israel. The letter from the Red Cross had been received, but that was the Stalin era. It was not safe to have contact with foreigners. They didn't reply. Later that evening, Ina, who lived in Jerusalem, spoke with her cousins in England for the first time. It was the culmination of a search that had started in 1944. I first reunited a family separated by the Holocaust in 2007. I've been able to repeat this several times. Each story is compelling. Some of the stories I tell you are about my family. Let's get some background information. We're going to talk about a member of my Kuznets family. My grandmother was a Kuznets. I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island. When I was a kid, a long time ago, in the 1950s, my father used to bring us to visit his cousin, Harry Schuster, and his wife, Elaine. They lived in nearby Middletown on Walcott Avenue at the corner of Purgatory Road, which went between First and Second Beach. For my sisters and I, the highlight of the visit was their dog. At the time, we weren't interested in the relationships. We had many cousins in Newport, and I think we took them for granted. This paper tree was created by a first cousin of my father, Joe Adelson. He was an accountant. My father's mother, Dvorsha Kuznets Ginsburg, was one of 4 Kuznets siblings who immigrated to Newport, Rhode Island. There were 4 other siblings. Their father, Abraham Kuznets, my great-grandfather, had several siblings. And this just shows my great-grandfather and who's right here, and his siblings. One of his siblings, David Kuznets, went to Waterbury, Connecticut with his wife and 8 children. He was the only one in that generation of this family that immigrated. Now, 2 of the other siblings, Riva or Presva and Chaika, both married Shapiros, although we don't know if the Shapiros were related. So their descendants went mostly to Waterbury, with the exception of Miriam Shapiro Schuster, the daughter of Shmuel and Pezva Kuznets, who went to Newport. Now, back in the early 2000s, when we were researching this, it wasn't so easy to find things online. When you look in the records, Miriam Schuster has a variety of names on the census. On her Matzava in Newport, we can see that her first name in Hebrew was Miriam, and her father was Shmuel or Samuel. I had a cousin in Newport going to the local historical society to look up their obituary connection, also to Newport City Hall in Middletown to check for death records. So this made it clear the relationship that Harry Schuster was a daughter of Kusiel Schuster and Miriam Shapiro Schuster. We also learned that he had a sister, Rosa Donor, of Carmel Heights, California, and a niece, Tasha. And that Harry also had sisters, Dora and Rosa, another sister, Rosa. Based on that message, a family tree, we were able to computerize them into a family tree. Now, Charles Schuster was born in Lepel, Belarus, which is not far from 20 miles north of the village where the Kuznets family lived. Now, in 2000, Harry Schuster's wife, Eileen, was still alive, but I was dealing with a large family and getting ready for a family reunion, and finding these people was not at the top of my list. In 2001, I found a poem dedicated to Rosa Donor on the occasion of her birthday in 1976 on a website, a blog called creativeedge.org. I wrote to the Creative Web and I got a message from Donald, who signed his message, "Love and Blessings." I thought, oy vey, that sure sounds like California. My efforts did not bear any fruit. I gave up. I revisited the subject in 2005. I found more information about Rosa Donor and her husband, Ephraim. Ephraim Donor was a painter. They met in Paris. They lived in Greenwich Village in the 1930s, and they were pioneers in the Monterey Peninsula after a road was built to make it accessible in 1948. Ephraim was also a character. Once he stood at a public meeting and proclaimed, "Big Sur is where you go to launder your karma." But I couldn't find any contact information for Tasha. Someone suggested I contact the Henry Miller Library. I got a polite response from Magnus Torren, who I think ran it, who promised to forward my message. But I kept pushing. So I eventually got in touch with the poet, Eliot. And Eliot actually had already received Magnus's message, and he brought it to Tasha, who responded very warmly, "Dear cousin Aaron, greetings. I'm blown away to learn that I have hundreds of cousins on my mother's side." And she thanked me very much. So when I visited California with my daughter in 2006, I met Tasha. She gave me a copy of her father's thesis, which was about Jewish jokes. We can skip this one here. And we can skip this. In 2007, I revisited my mother's family. Her father was, and up to this point, I was only interested in my own family. My mother grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts. Her father, my Zadie, Jacob Pokros, was born in Gordishi, Ukraine. It's in the Cherkasy Oblast. And there's more than one place named Gordishi. Just like there's more than one place named Newport. So these are just some family photos. But the original last name wasn't Pokros. This is the manifest for my grandfather's brother, Israel. And you can see, if you look at it, that the name ends in an E, so it's Pokrasa. Now, the most common spelling is Pokrasa with an A. Of course, there's no right way to spell something. The name comes from an obsolete Ukrainian word meaning to decorate, such as decorating a house. So it's an occupational name. In my immediate family, they were in the occupation. My grandfather, Jacob Pokros, owned a paint and wallpaper store. And his brother, Israel, took houses and altered them to become apartments. So as an occupational name, there's no reason to think everybody with that last name is related. In 2000, we were contacted by Professor David Guss of Tufts University, who was from the part of the Pokros family that left Fall River for New York and New Jersey, which was a smart thing to do because Fall River was a declining mill town that probably reached its height in the early 1920s and has been declining since then. There was enough information to have a family reunion. Now, I had registered, and that's the picture from the Pokros family reunion in 2000. Now, of course, I registered on the Jewish Gen Family Finder searching Pokros. So that meant people were able to send me messages. So I actually got a message in 2006 from Mark Lewis, who lived in London, England. He described his Pokros family. He was just starting his search, and he asked me for advice. So my advice basically was to contact everyone. When I revisited the Pokros family in 2007, a year later, I contacted him, and I was surprised to learn that he followed my advice. But since he didn't know where his family was from, he went a bit further. He hired Miriam Wiener, who was a researcher, and asked her to search various towns in Ukraine for Pokrasa. She was able to pinpoint his family to Zlatopol, Ukraine. She wrote a report, which I got a copy of, and it had a record of the birth of my great-grandfather, Pinkas Pokrasa, in 1953 in Gordishi. Mark called a family meeting in a movie theater in London to announce his findings. One of his cousins said, "Why don't we fly to Zlatopol?" in my plane. They were rather well off. So a bunch of cousins flew into this small town in Ukraine, which opened a closed airport just for him. Mark hopped off the plane. When no one came off after 45 minutes, Mark asked why. He was told, "Mr. Lewis, we have a problem. Everyone on the plane has the same last name." I use Google to look for more information. On this page, there are 4 hits for Gary Pokrasa, who was an officer of Lakeland Industries, a publicly held company. Every time his company made an announcement, his name was on it. I contacted Gary. He sent me a 10-page report about his family, written by his 80-year-old cousin, Abraham Pokrasa. The family had visited from Zolotonosha, Ukraine, via France. Abraham's mother took him to Paris in 1938 to visit the relatives. Gary had assumed that his family that lived in Zolotonosha, Ukraine, had died in the Holocaust. Gary also had a letter that he received in 1977. He was an accountant and saved everything. And so he had no trouble finding this letter. It was written by Alan Haight, who went to the phone book collection in the Philadelphia Public Library and wrote letters to everybody whose names was Pokrasa or similar. Alan's family was from Boguslav, Ukraine. He was interested in everything Pokrasa, particularly celebrities. According to him, a celebrity is somebody that the family thinks is a celebrity. He even collected the names of Pokrasa mobsters and bootleggers, and there were some. A celebrity is a celebrity. This was in the late 70s, and probably something that got his interest was roots, as well as, which also stimulated Arthur Kurzweil, who wrote articles and eventually a book about finding your Jewish roots. So this shows where the 4 families that I was in touch with now were found. Zolonosha, Boguslav, Gordishi, and Zlatopol. So they're basically southeast of Kiev, some of them being in the Kiev gubernia. And this is the Dnieper River here. So I created a simple website describing the 4 families. It's called You Say Pokrasa. That's Mark Lewis's idea because he pointed at me that you could end Pokrasa in an A or an E. And so he said to me, you say tomato, I say tomato. And that's how I came up with the name of the website, You Say Pokrasa. In the description of Gary Pokrasa's family, I mentioned that they died in the Holocaust. In June 2007, I went onto Skype and sent a chat message to 65 people whose last name started Pokras, P-O-K-R-A-S, telling them to look at the website. Early in the morning on Father's Day 2007, I received a message from Dmitry Pokras in Kiev. He wrote, I am interested in my relatives. My ancestors lived in the village of Zolotnasha. My great-grandfather was born there. His name was Leba. He told me that some of his relatives went to France. I realized that I had reunited Gary Pokrasa's family, and I started crying. Dmitry told me that one of his relatives, Arnold Pokras, had moved to the United States. Dmitry and Gary were members of a family that was separated by Hitler and by Stalin. After 70 years, the family was reunited. I called Gary at 6:30 a.m. with the good news. Gary's wife gave him an elbow to pick up the phone, and Gary's reaction was, who died now? I was a pharmacist, and at that point, I was working every other weekend. This was a Sunday. So when I got home from work at 7, I realized that contact had not been made with Arnold Pokras, who lived in Baltimore. I found his phone number and called him up. He had been in the United States for 18 years. That evening, 80-year-old Manhattan-born Abraham Pokrasa spoke to his 69-year-old cousin, Arnold Pokras, who lived in Baltimore. They had never heard of each other until that day. That was the start of my career, reuniting families. A month later, Gary held a Pokrasa family reunion in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. The Pokrasas from Baltimore were visiting relatives in New York. So Abraham Pokrasa is standing. You see Gary there and Arnold. And across from Arnold is his wife, Lilia. Gary has since retired and devotes most of his life to genealogy and to his grandchildren. He's the data acquisition director for the Jewish Gen Ukraine Research Division. He's a good speaker, and he's got a lot of work to do because he's in charge of getting the 2 million documents that Alex Krakowski has scanned from Ukrainian archives, translated and digitized on jewishgen.org. My next opportunity to reunite a family happened immediately. At the reunion, the Pokrasa reunion, Lilia Pokrasa took me aside and said, "My grandfather, Gregory Stayman, was a tailor from Pinsk. He got permission to live in Kiev. During the Russian Empire, Jews could not legally live in Kiev without a permit. He died in 1924. My grandfather died in Bab Yar along with 2 sisters. A son was also killed by the Nazis in Kiev." She told me that in the United States, that the last name had been changed to Stern, and Stern had married a Diamond. She gave me some Diamond family pictures from the mid-60s. The families had kept in touch thanks to a communist intermediary. After a visit by the intermediary in 1967, family members in Ukraine were summoned to a meeting with the secret police. They were asked if they wanted to live in America. They said, of course not, and they cut off contact with their American relatives. Lilia looked at me and said, "Aaron, find my family." I was feeling pretty powerful, so I said, "Piece of cake." Then I forgot. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from Lilia. "Have you found them yet?" I posted a message to the Jewish Gen Ukraine Special Interest Group saying what I knew. In the message, I wrote that Esther Stern married a man whose last name was Diamond, and their children were Howard, Richard, and Bruce, and that Bruce was born in 1949 and 1950. I got one reply. "There's a Rabbi Bruce Diamond living in Fort Myers, Florida. I don't know anything about his family." Soon I spoke with Bruce Diamond, who said, "Yes, it's my family." And he let his mother know and thanked me. The picture was from his bar mitzvah. I spoke to his mother, Esther, who started crying. "Thank you for helping our family. I know that when the war began, my dad was worried about his family in Kiev. I had seen their pictures. Portraits of his parents were always hanging in our home. After he died, those portraits are hanging on my home, along with photographs of his sister and brother." Going forward, Lilia and Arnold were included in Diamond family events. Esther Diamond told me that her father's 2 sisters had married 2 Saltzman brothers. She told me that the Saltzman family was involved in the Yiddish theater. And could I help her find her cousin Esther, the famous Yiddish film actress, who she had not spoken to in many years? Once again, I replied, "Piece of cake." I found of course, I had never heard of Esther Salzman. I found an online interview with Esther Salzman at the Millikan Archive, and I soon discovered that she had spoken at the New York Jewish Film Festival in 2007. I sent a message to the film festival, and the next day, the 2 cousins were able to speak to each other after 29 years. After this, I was a changed person. I realized I enjoyed researching families other than my own. This is Molly Pecan, and the picture, and this is from a Yiddish movie called Jacob Oyes Tus Leben, and that's Esther Salzman right there. In 2009, Esther Salzman died. Her son, Jamie Lubin, got interested in his family history. He found the Stayman story Anusepa Krasa. And he told me that Harry Stern and Esther Diamond, in addition to Molly Peiken, were at his bar mitzvah in 1958 and his wedding in 1967. No one ever told him, as far as he could remember, that they were related. I put in touch with Esther Diamond after 50 years. Let's move on to another example. Would lightning strike again? 3 years later, it did in my Kuznets family. On the left is my father, Morris Ginsburg, with his mother, Dvorsha Kuznets Ginsburg, behind him. That picture must have been taken not long after everyone was in Newport in 1921. This is a picture of my great-grandparents, Avraham Kuznets and Rochel Dresha Levin. Abraham died in Poland in 1921. Rochel died in Poland in 1931. This just gives you a map showing where the family village was Uzgrimi. The nearest place of any size is Begomel. We're going back to this paper family tree. So this shows my great-grandparents, their 8 children, 4 of whom went to Newport, Rhode Island. We knew that one brother, Shimon, was burned to death in a synagogue in Dolin, Belarus, with his wife, Sarah, daughter, Hannah, and granddaughter, Rachel. But what happened to my grandmother's brother, Berka Kuznets, who was married to Rachel and had 4 children, at least according to this family tree? As you know, Yad Vashem collects the name of Holocaust victims. They went online in 2004. So I started searching for Kuznets with Dogshitz, which is fairly nearby, and where many Jews from Newport came. I drew a blank. A genealogical acquaintance pointed out that in 2010, I might have the long location. Of course, he was right. My family lived in Uzgrimi, not Dogshitz. So that seemed like 6 wasted years. So I started again. I started with the default search, looking for last name Kuznets. There were no hits. So I went to the advanced search, and you probably should try both when you're searching. And then you can choose your search option. And I chose a Dage Motorcroft SoundX search, which searches by the sound, but it's friendly to Eastern European Jewish names. The problem here was there were 1,600 hits. So I needed to cut the number of hits. So I added in Berker's first name as well as his last name. Now there are only 22 hits. But one of them, which is with the blue arrow, was for a Berka Kuznets from Borisov. So the date of birth sounded right for my grandparents' generation. And Borisov is quite close to Uzgrimi. So I looked at the page of testimony, which is one way of that Yad Vashem gets his name. It's just a form that people can submit. So according to the page, which was submitted in 2008, so it wasn't even there in 2004, Berka was born in Begomel, which is only 3 kilometers from Uzgrimi, where my family lived. His father's name was Abraham, and that's a match for my great-grandfather. And the form was submitted by his grandson, Abraham Kuznets, who lived in Minsk. So it was just a matter of getting somebody to look up the phone number, and somebody did that. And with the help of a translator, my wife at the time, I called him up. He had no idea that he had relatives in the United States. I visited my family in Minsk, started in 2015. over the years, they shared stories. Burka had 3 children, as far as they, and his wife Raquel had 3 children. So Boris was descended from their daughter Sarah. Vladimir, Sofia, and Rima was suggested from their son Hirsch. Meyer, the 3rd child, had no children. Meyer joined the revolution in 1917 when he was 15 years old. He became head of the Komsomol in Belarusia. And in 1921, he was promoted and sent to Moscow, where he met Stalin. Now, if you're a communist in Stalin's Russia, that's the worst thing you can have on your resume. He was arrested along with many other communists in 1938 and sentenced to 10 years. He was released in 1948, called his family to tell them where he was and was rearrested 6 months later and sentenced to an additional 10 years. He wasn't released until 1956. I am president of the Friends of Jewish Dog-Shitsi, which is not far from Uskrimi, where the Kuznets family live. I often hear from fellow descendants, usually by email. But Cheryl, in March 2012, I received an actual letter from Cheryl Zellman. I barely knew how to open the envelope. It's so unusual to get letters. She wrote, my grandfather, Moshe Zalmanov, was born in Dogshitz about 1893. He arrived in America in 1912. My great-grandfather was either Avram or Yankel. As far as I know, my great-grandparents did not perish in the Holocaust, although my grandfather thought they had. His younger brother Mendel was a revolutionary who became a commissar and saved the family. My grandfather wrote to him but never heard back. I have a wonderful picture. I went to Yad Vashem. Once again, a basic search didn't get any results, so I did a Soundex search. And there was at least one hit for Yankel Avraham Zalmanov from Bogomil. So as we already know, that's close to Dogshitz or Dog-Shitsi. So the page of testimony was submitted by a relative, Fyodor Karpelovich. So I wrote to Cheryl, suggested that she contact the submitter. If I were doing this today, I would have tried to contact the submitter myself. So she did what she did with me. She sent a letter. 1 month later, she let me know that she had written to her relatives and they had replied, and they both had this picture in their files. And this kind of shows the family, what happened to them. So Abram Yankel, his wife Shana, their daughter Rosa, and so on. She eventually met with a relative who had immigrated to California. The Jews in Bogomil were murdered on October 2nd, 1941, Erev Yom Kippur. They didn't know that there was a Holocaust. They were just inside the Soviet Union, and they thought they were being relocated, which is not unusual in Stalin's Russia. They were arrested and held in the basement of the building in this picture, which was used as a police station. The man there, Vladimir Konstantinov Gerasimenuk, was a childhood witness who heard the shooting while he was with his family picking potatoes. The victims was marched to this area where they were shot in front of a pre-dug pit. In 1967, the remains were exhumed, placed in 3 coffins, and reburied in a cemetery. In 2016, with the help of local officials, a memorial ceremony was held. I placed a rock on the monument, thinking of Cheryl's family. The monument does not have the usual boilerplate text on many of the monuments. It reads, "To you, victims of fascism, the hatred to your murderers will never subside in our hearts." Okay, next, we're going to discuss the Alexandrov family. Now, this is a little lighter. In 2011, I lived in Natick, Massachusetts. I got to know the local Chabad rabbi, Levi Fogelman, who often welcomed people to Friday night dinner at his home. The reason I did is because it was a bit of a hike for me to go to Temple Israel, where I would normally go, the conservative synagogue, and I had to go to the Chabad house on the way. So finally, I peeked in there, and it was friendly. In November of 2011, I met Bina Fisalevich at one of those dinners. She had immigrated from the Soviet Union. So I asked her if she was looking for family in the United States. She was looking for relatives in Canada. She had been in the United States for 11 years, but life has its ups and downs, and she had not started looking. I got a message from her on November 16th with this 1966 photo, which is of her grandfather, her sister Jenya, and his brother Baruch from Canada. The last name, she said, was Alexandrovich, and in calendar, they changed it to Alexandrov, ending with 2 Fs. This picture was taken in 1972 with Baruch's son Morris, his wife Golda, and Baruch's grandchildren. I did an exact search spelling, and I found, this is using Ancestry.com. There were 221 hits, but I found a listing for Bernat or Boris, and I realized Baruch could easily become Boris. The date of birth, 1878, seemed to match the look of Baruch in the 1966 pictures. He would have been 88 in 1966. What else could I find out? I went to jewishgen.org, and I found a burial record on the Jewish Online Worldwide Burial Registry for Bernat Alexandrov. So this sounded right, and it had 2 Fs. Using Google, I found an article about him from 1956. He had arrived in 1905. He was one of the oldest Jewish settlers in the Junction neighborhood and was an organizer and former president of the Junction Shul, and had 4 sons, Joseph, Morris, Maurice, Harry, and Max. So this sounds very much like a match. Finally, I found a family tree on Ancestry that showed that only 1 son was alive. I was certain it was correct family. This took an hour. The next step was to reach out to the Canadian families. I looked in the phone book, and there was an H. Alexandrov. So I gave him a call. I took a chance that this was Harry. He answered the phone, and it was true. It was the right family. He remembered his father's visit to the relatives in Russia. One of his brothers went. Harry had to stay behind to keep an eye on the family business. I asked who else he could talk to. He suggested his son, Brian, B-R-Y-O-N, but his mind was deciding to go, and he couldn't find Brian's phone number, but he said he was a real estate agent. Well, of course, real estate agents want to be found. So I sent him a message, and he replied, "This is all on the same day, and thanked me for connecting to him." And so the family was reunited. This family was still involved with the Junction Shul, although the Jewish community no longer lived nearby. the people had restored the synagogue, and this is unusual, an original immigrant synagogue. It was only open during the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In 2013, Harry's father died. He and his wife decided to take a break and visit Boston. During the time, the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies was having their convention in Boston. Should I go to the convention banquet, or should I go to the Back Bay Hotel where the Alexandra family was getting together? What would you do? I sold my banquet ticket and went to the hotel. Let's watch the Alexandras having a good time.
It's a great idea to make it possible. It's amazing.
Look, you all have the same Alexandra times, right?
Yes.
Yes. Brian? You're forgetting something, Brian.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for making this all possible.
That really left me with a good feeling. Now we'll talk about the Bolash family. And I visited Parfyanov in Belarus in 2015, where 40 of my Ginsburg relatives were murdered. I visited there several times, but in 2015, I was introduced to Maria Balash, or Bolash, who was born in 1936. On the far left, we're with the head of the village council, and I'm sitting in the blue is the English teacher who was serving as a translator. And I'm sitting next to Marvin Kabakov. He lives in Jamaica Plain, the Jamaica Plain section of Boston, but he was originally from New Haven. Maria told me her parents were friendly with the Ravelson family, but they were my relatives. She also told us how during the war, her parents hid a survivor, Jacob Castrol, in their shed, which she didn't know initially. Later, I learned that the location of the survivor, Jacob Castrol, was discovered, and a German soldier found out about it and tipped off the right people, enabling Jacob Castrol and his brother Isaac, who was also hiding in the village, to be moved and survived. In this picture, Maria is standing in the center in a white dress, and it's I think it's her confirmation. There's 4 German soldiers in the picture, and they know that the middle one is Eric, the hero of the story. I hope one day to find out Eric's last name and get recognition for him and the people in Parfyanova who saved who saved the life of the Castrols. Finally, she said, "Why did my relatives in New Haven, Connecticut stop writing to me?" And she had pictures and letters to show. I let Marvin Kabakov handle this since he was from New Haven. Maria's grandfather had gone to New Haven before World War I, after getting in hot water during the Russian Empire. He left his wife with 3 boys. In the US, his wife got a message that she better follow him. So she left the 3 boys with relatives and joined him in the United States. In the United States, the couple had 3 daughters, and Marvin found that the 3 daughters were either senile or deceased without children. The 3 boys were left in Russia, and they families were never reunited. Maria kept asking, and a couple of years later, I decided to investigate because I'm the genealogist. Marvin's the historian. So I started searching on Ancestry. And there were a lot of people with the last name Bolash living in New Haven, Connecticut. I eventually found somebody with the family tree, Laura Stawicki. It turned out there were at least 3 Bolashes who had immigrated. And soon I was in touch with Karl Tulovich, who lived as his granddaughter, daughter of one of the immigrants. His grandmother had a bunch of letters from Belarus, including the envelopes with addresses. So the question was from her, why did her relatives stop communicating? It turned out that Maria's grandfather was a cousin of these 3 brothers that immigrated. So at this time, the grandmother was alive. So whenever Karl had a question, he just asked his grandmother. He lived with his grandmother. The next challenge was to find the family in Belarus. Thanks to the letters, we had names and addresses. Elena Korostuk, an English teacher in Belarus, helped to find the Bolash family that was scattered in Poland and Belarus. Here she's explaining how she had done it for her own family. She was an English teacher and a wonderful person. She spent a week doing this for the Bolash family and found people all over. She subsequently died from COVID. Karl's relatives invited him to visit Belarus. I had to go to New York to meet them and him and to pass a Mensch test. I guess I passed. In Belarus, Karl and I rendezvoused at Maria's house with extended family members, some of whom had never met. Maria's nephew, Pavel, suggested we visited the cemetery where the family was buried and that we visit the Holocaust site where many of my relatives were murdered. Not only the Bolash family was in this cemetery, Jacob Castrol had stayed in the village and his grave was here too. In the picture we're with Pavel's son, also named Pavel, and Castus, a local who was very interested in history. Castus is now in exile in Poland because of his politics. The Holocaust site was behind a fence and not visible from the street. Pavel, the father, also offered to help resolve that. He arranged for the fence to be moved back and a path to the monument. This is something I've been worried about since I found out about it from 2008. I didn't expect a reward for unifying the Bolash family. The unification itself was the reward. So this was a pleasant surprise. Now we're going to go to something a little more current. This is something that happened last year. A friend of mine asked me to do some research about his grandfather, Maurice Lieberman. He shared with me Maurice Lieberman's entry in the American Jewry Who's Who from 1938 and 39. So I don't know if you are familiar with Who's Who's, but it was a popular way to find people. And so there were reference books, and they usually got their information by sending letters to a category of people and asking them to submit their information and to help to subsidize the cost of the book. So it's something I frankly looked my nose up until I saw how useful they are. So the neat thing about the entry is, in this case, most of the entries are coming directly from the person. So they're from the horse's mouth. So this was this overwhelming thing with his credentials. And he was a longtime Hebrew school director at Temple Kehilloth Israel in Brookline, Massachusetts, probably for 30 years. But the main things from a genealogy standpoint are his place of birth, Pleschenitz, his date of birth, the fact that his father was Wolf Lieberman and his mother was Tilka Kahul, or Kugel it could be, and that he came to the United States in 1910. So knowing when he came and where he came from, I started searching for his ship's manifest. Now you can either search the Ellis Island database directly, or you can use dmorse.org, who has a great search engine for the Ellis Island database and a few other things, actually. So I started searching anyone who came from Pleschnitz or Pleschnitzy, but I couldn't find any Liebermans, although I was using a 5-year range. Took a little stumbling. And I searched for all the Moshe Liebermans that came through Ellis Island from 1908 to 1912. One stuck out. Now, one of his credentials was that he had studied at the Sorbonne. So one stuck out because he was living in Paris. So this shows the search. I'm doing a sounds like search, and it shows the range of years that I'm searching. And I looked for up to 500 hits, but there are only 11. So this shows the manifest, and this is him right here, Moshe Lieberman. If we look very closely, we can see on the second page, he was from Pleschenitz. And we can see here that he was living in Paris. What else can we do with him? Well, we could go on jewishgen.org. So if we search for Lieberman from Pleschenitzy, we can disregard the hits from the Jewish Gen Family Finder because they're searching all of Belarus. So there's really only 4 hits, but 2 of them are from Lvov, and they really didn't have anything to do with Pleschnitz. And in the marriage record, the Lieberman was not from Pleschnitz, the other spouse was. So we're down to 2 hits. 1 hit, really, the Duma listing. So we're going to ignore that. All right, so there is a Wolf, or Wolf Lieberman, which is the name of Moshe Lieberman's father. This is from 1906. He's living in Pleschnitzy. And we can't really prove that it's likely that this is the father of Moshe Lieberman, but we can't absolutely prove that. But if it is, his father's name was Reuben, which means we could also search Reuben Lieberman. We're not going to do that here, though. We're going to turn to Yad Vashem. First, I searched all the victims from Pleschenitzy. There were 474 results. It's not as difficult to go through them as you think, because there's 50 on a page. So it's only 10 pages. I found 2 pages for Brothers of Morris. And they were submitted by the same person in Parnas, Hannah. They had the same parents as Morris. And the women who submitted them said they were uncles of her husband. So one of them was for Abraham Lieberman, in this case, son of Vladimir and Tilka. And the other one was Semyon Lieberman, son of Velvil. So Velvil is Yiddish for wolf, I think. Antilka. So these are a match. So they're two siblings of Morris Lieberman. So these were submitted in about 2005. So assuming these people can be the woman and her husband can be contacted, or the descendants are contacted, there's a potential family reunion here. Last night, to prepare for this, I searched in a different way. I included the last name and location. I picked up 3 additional hits. 2 of them were for the same person, Itka or Ida. They were submitted at 2 different times by the same submitter. I'm still waiting to get those translated. They both said Ida's daughter, whose maiden name was Lieberman, and they had her birth as in Pleshinitsi, and the second one gave her parents as Velville and Tilka. So now we have another sibling of Moshe Lieberman, a sister. So there's 3 siblings that died from the Holocaust. And she died in Pleshinitsi, or she appeared to it. So until I have them translated, I won't be sure. So why did I miss Ida the first time? If you do a general search, victims are not going to appear by their maiden name. So also, the name of the submitter was listed slightly differently. So when I clicked on the name of the submitter, which you can do and you should do from the first listing to get her other submittals, I didn't pick them up. So obviously, a general search is not going to pick up everything, and that strategy was not good enough. Someday, I'm hoping that there will be a family reunion if there are descendants. So we've got one. I think this is my last example. Now I'm going to admit it. I admit it. I'm addicted to Facebook. So this is during the COVID times, October 2020, at 7:43 in the morning. I think it was actually earlier. I saw this posting on Facebook. It's by Maria Sinfarb, and she created a Facebook group called Jewish Families from Belarus. She was computerizing a friend's family history. Her friend had immigrated from Russia to Brooklyn in 1993. When Maria heard the story about this picture, she couldn't resist posting it. So in addition to the picture, it spoke about David Gurovich. He immigrated to the United States after a 1905 pogrom. He was from Lepo. He owned purportedly a kielbasa or sausage factory. It named the name of his father, Yankel, mother, Tamara, brothers, Miron and Mark, and sister, Doba. By the way, Gurovich is the same name as Horovich or Horovitz. In Russian, they don't really have a clear letter for an H. So it can become a G. So it's the same name, which is a very common Jewish last name. So this just shows this part of that family on the Ginsburg family tree. So at the top, we see David Kuznets, my great-grandfather's brother, who immigrated to Waterbury with 8 children, and this shows their spouses. And one of the children, Fanny, married David Gurovitz. But oddly enough, they didn't maybe it's not so odd, but they got married in Waterbury. They immigrated separately. So of course I remember this. I opened up the family tree, and there was a David Gurovitz married to Fanny, who immigrated to Waterbury. At the time, I had him listed in Vitebsk, but that work was done in 2000. So I had to do a little research to find out where David Gurovitz actually was from. Using Ancestry, I found him in the 1927 Waterbury census, and sure enough, he was a meat cutter. I contacted my cousins in California, and they had this picture. So this sounds pretty close to being a sausage family, but was from David in from Lepel. Using Ancestry, I found Fanny Gervitz's naturalization petition, which showed when her husband arrived in New York. She had actually arrived the same year, and they got married in Waterbury. So we got an alternate spelling of his name, Gurewitch. And his first name was actually Meyer, according to this naturalization index card for him. Okay, so that brings home the point that your name in the United States might not be similar at all to your name in the old country. So can we find the ship's manifest? Using Ancestry.com, I searched for Meyer. There were 28 hits. This screen shows the first 7, of which 6 in green were from Meyer, including the index card that we've already found, his hamburger passenger listing, and a link to his ship's manifest, which was this link right here. So from all of this, we learned that sure enough, he was from Lepel, and he was born in Lepel. Of course, we already knew this, but it was filled out on the ship's manifest, which was also where he was living before he immigrated. Just to show you the geography again, the Kuznets lived in Oostermee, which was literally now is just a bunch of houses along one street. Lepel was about 30 miles away. It makes you wonder if the families already knew each other. So this just shows you what Oostermee is today. And I've been there a couple of times. It's really just this street with houses. And Lepel is by comparison a metropolis. So it had a substantial Jewish community. By the way, in this picture here, this is the Berezina River, which is a major river in Belarus. So there's at least 2 towns named Berezina in Belarus. So let's go back to this picture again. This is David Gurevich before immigration. His brother Mark, Mark's wife, and Mark's daughter Dina. Now, Mark's family ended up in the Russian Far East in Samarkand. I'm not sure whether they immigrated, whether they went in the 1905 period or in the, say, after World War I, when a lot of people fled Belarus. So I'm not sure when they actually went there. So Dina, the daughter, married Samuel Bakhromi, who was an immigrant from Persia. They had 3 children, the grandchildren of Mark and Frida. Dina and 2 of her children immigrated to Brooklyn in 1993. Among their newfound relatives in California are the grandchildren of David. So the grandchildren of David and Mark are second cousins. They're approximately the same age in their 1980s. Well, I want to thank the Triangle Jewish JGS, and I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. There are many paths to being reunited, and we've explored some of them. And that's it. So let's stop this. I'm going to stop the screen share.
Okay, Aaron, we've got some questions for you too, and some observations. Thank you very much for sharing your approach. I think you pretty much try everything. And Barbara commented in the chat, it appears that you've had some really good luck too. That serendipity is often a part in our roles as researchers.
I agree with that. And there's this, I don't think this is brain science, but there's a learning curve, especially with jewishgen.org and Ancestry and Yad Vashem.
Yes. I wanted to share a couple of the pages that you had mentioned. I'm pretty sure our members are aware of Jewish Gen Family Finder. The easiest way to get to this site is just to Google Jewish Gen Family Finder, and you'll get a link, and to register yourself and the families that you're looking for just by clicking in enter, okay, or modify if you're modifying, but to start with listing. And then, of course, you saw how Aaron was searching this particular database for names, and that's a wonderful resource. And you'll notice again that you put in a surname and you can do a phonetic search, and you also saw that Aaron was doing a lot of the Deutsch Mokotov soundex. So tried a lot of different ways. So that's one website. Again, it's jewishgen.org, but you want to get to the Jewish Family Finder. And another one that you mentioned was Yad Vashem. I have to say, Aaron, it really irritates me when I talk to people about their roots and they say, well, everybody died in the Holocaust. Well, there were millions of people who died in the Holocaust, but not everybody. They were lost in the whirlwind. And for whatever reason, and Barbara commented on this as well, people just stopped looking for each other, thinking they were dead. But, that's where genealogists and researchers come in. We sometimes find, as you did, that in fact, no, not everybody did die. So you saw Aaron do a search of Yad Vashem, which is at, you can see the website address is up here, and I can put it into chat if you want. But most importantly, I think you were absolutely right to suggest you need to use the advanced search mechanism where you can narrow your search. And also, one thing I found very helpful was to also do a search under a submitter's name. So you'll notice down here, submitter, once you have somebody who has entered one name, they've probably entered 10 names of people who were murdered in the Holocaust. So you want to do a search on a submitter's name, because not only did they list one cousin, they might have listed 10 cousins. So I thought that was a really good reminder, particular to me, that's a great way to search. Let me go backwards here in the chat. I think a couple of your colleagues did show up, Aaron. I think Vicki was here. So let's start with Karen Abrams. Hi, Karen. Karen said that in one part of your adventures, you showed us emails from 2005 to 2006, and she wants to know, did you scan those emails? Is that how they were in the presentation? And maybe you can just talk about the value of those emails.
Well, I try to save all of my messages. So I can, if I've got an email, I got several different things I could do. I could just copy and paste into a text box, or I can take I don't scan them. I could take a screenshot. So that's how some of the slides are created.
Okay. Karen, did that answer your question? Okay. Rob has a question also. You mentioned a first name of Vladimir in one of your adventures again. How did you know those first names are the same? Vladimir doesn't sound like the others.
Well, I think because the other parent matched, I would assume that it's not just here, but also in Russia, people look for secular names or more Russian sounding names, but they had some resemblance. So the fact that it started with a V and Wolf or Wolf starts with a V was good enough. But the other parent matched and the place matched. So the fact that Vladimir doesn't perfectly match is overwhelmed by the other matches and by the fact that it's from the same submitter.
I see that Rob is joined by his wife, Debbie Moose. And again, we have that nice these hybrid couples, one who's more interested in the other or trying to figure out, the other person's culture. Rob, did that answer your question about the guess about Vladimir? Do you want to unmute maybe? You can just hit your space bar. That's a real fast way to unmute. You're still muted, Rob. Hit your space bar.
All right, now we should be hearable.
You're
Okay.
good.
I actually asked that question, so I'm
Oh.
like, sound alike. But it's the preponderance of evidence, I suppose, and it is pretty amazing, what he's done, and I guess it helps if you're looking for semi-famous people and not peddlers.
And also, I think Aaron was blessed with having unusual names. Not like Barbara Friedman, Friedman, Levin. He had Parasa, and some of the names you were looking for, Aaron, I think it's a blessing to have a rarer name as a subject of your study.
Well, in the Pokrasa case, there's a bunch of I've got a lot more families now on that website. But the interesting thing is my Pokrasa families are Levites. And I know that because it says so in all the headstones in the Hebrew cemetery in Fall River. But some of the other Pokrasa families, like Mark Lewis's family, is also Levites. And some of the other families are. And also the name Pinchas Pokros runs through many of these families.
Okay.
So somebody has been looking at the Alex Rakowski documents before they're translated. He's actually been able to put four or five families together in a gigantic family going back to the about 1800.
That's phenomenal.
I think Debbie, one of the things about Vladimir and Velvel is that Vladimir is a very Russian name. And I don't think that would be the Jewish name of somebody born in Russia, but Velvel is very common. And it although it's not always reliable to go off the initial letter, sometimes that gives you a clue that it's the same person.
That's a
So
good
Vladimir
observation.
would not be a Hebrew name. It's a Russian name.
Karen had another interesting technical question. You used a lot of Google Maps in your slides, and she wanted to know, how do you make the Google Maps with the dark black names of cities?
Well, I take a screenshot of the map. By the way, it's better in taking a screenshot to use the biggest possible screen, because I think you'll get a higher quality picture. And then I just throw a text box there, and that's how I get the names on. That's how I highlight the names. I just use a text box. You can do that in your. I use Keynote, which is an Apple program, but you can use the Windows equivalent, so you can easily do that in a presentation program, even if you don't use the program for a presentation.
Okay.
Or you can, I'm sure you can do it in Google, also has their own presentation program.
I didn't know that. Thank you. Debbie Moose has, I think this is Debbie's question, not Rob's. She wanted to know, and Debbie, again, you're going to have to unmute yourself because I wasn't real clear about your question. You said, does Steve Morse include Philadelphia? And I know he includes Philadelphia as a port of entry, but you're looking for something else besides immigration records?
No, it was it. You answered my question.
Okay.
Thank you. You answered my question. That's what I meant, because I saw a lot of New York there, but we need to look through Philadelphia or even Baltimore. So
Okay. Well,
Although he actually links to Ancestry, and so he links to Ancestry. However, there's a way to search for free using FamilySearch.org. Now, it's owned by the Mormon Church, so I personally would not post any information on that website. But it's a free version of Ancestry. It's got a lot of things on it.
and as I pointed out to Debbie, there is a section here on Philadelphia. Steve Morse's website is it's getting longer and longer because he's got these great one-step solutions to doing searches that would normally take you forever. So if you haven't been to Steve Morse, and make sure you go to .org, not .com. It's stevemorse.org. Just if you haven't been there in a while, just keep scrolling down because chances are find something that'll be very helpful to you. It's not always about Jewish records, but it's mostly about Jewish records. Okay, let's see. And Stanley, Dr. Roboy, could you explain your comment? Because when you're talking about DNA technology, and I just better turn the microphone over to you. So if you'll hit your space bar, you can unmute.
Okay, I just did. So often, anyone who's had a DNA testing will get back a list from the companies of other people who are potential relations. They can be first cousins, second cousins, all the way to very, very distant. When they are first and second cousin, the chances are it's real, but so often the name of the person is completely unknown. Even if you spent a lot of time in genealogy and you know your family relations, your mother's fathers, and you can go back from your great grandparents and know their families, the name still is unknown. What I want to know is what approaches might one take to further delineate what is the relation? How do you identify the families?
I admit I'm still learning about DNA, but I do have a theory. I'm not sure this will help you and me.
Good. Actually, Aaron and I show up as we are, I think, second cousins by DNA technology.
So I have to run this by the resident DNA expert at Jewish Genealogical Society, Greater Boston. My theory is the problem is with the more distant the hit is. Let's grant that you related in that way, which is still an estimate. The problem is there are more and more possible ways you could be related because you have, the number of your ancestors doubles every time you go back. So I think you could narrow it if you could get multiple hits with an extended family. I think if you got multiple hits with people in an extended family, that might be a way of narrowing the relationship.
That assumes that many people from the family have had DNA testing, but when you have a single one, just like Aaron and myself, it shows that we're all worried about endogamy. If you have very distant relations, you can get a little bit from one, a little bit from another, and it shows up that you're cousins. But when it shows up your first or second cousins at that relation, chances are it's not going to be endogamy. But when you see the name and say there's no relation, you can't figure out where that person is. What are the next steps to try to decipher it? And I don't have good answers. I don't know which of the DNA people who are the experts to turn to try to get impressions how to explore this.
Doesn't it? It seems to me that Aaron's very old-fashioned technique of contacting people and writing emails to see, because on these sites, Dan, you never get the family tree, or it's rare that you do. Yeah. So you need to, if you have the time, to write multiple emails to all of these second cousins and to get their family tree from them and to find out, are there any common names? That's not a fast way to do it, but that would seem to me to be one way to do it. Aaron?
Right. Well, the problem is the further back you go, unfortunately, the less evidence there is, then the less people will know. So that only works up to a point. I mean, I had a DNA match with a Kuznets cousin, but it was to my, it would have been to my great-grandfather's great-grandfather's generation. But it had the last name Kuznets in common. So but as I was pointing out earlier, we could easily be related in another way. So I'm trying to get more of my cousins on board, and also to get them. You can take the Ancestry DNA file, download it, and upload it to free to My Family Heritage for free. You can create a small family tree there. So you may pick up other matches that way. And then you can go back to Ancestry to research them if you subscribe to Ancestry. So the question is, so these distant relations, possible relations, invited me to visit. I was coming back from Ukraine in May, and they invited me to visit them in Stuttgart and Munich. So how could I say no? They were putting me up. So we had a great time, but I don't know whether we're related or not. But I think I'm adopting them in any case.
Stan, if you want to remind me and send me an email, I can put you in touch with Israel Pickholz, who was the first person who I was aware of who wrote about endogamy. And he's done some incredible research in responding to the question that you're addressing. And maybe he can help you. And also, we have a member who is a forensic genealogist now. He's actually the vice president of our society. We don't see him too often because he's a young man with a lot of irons in the fire. His name is Jarrett Ross. So I'm happy to give you his information as well. I don't know if Rusty there's Rusty. Rusty sent me this wonderful New York Times article yesterday. I don't know how many of you saw the story about how the police out in Moscow, Idaho, actually found the killer of those 4 students. And, I was envious in a way, because the DNA is certainly using DNA technique was part of finding the killer, but they had a team of people from the FBI and the Moscow Police Department following all of these obscure leads. If we all had teams helping us with our research, we would get where we're going a lot faster, but I don't think it would be more fun necessarily. Bill Batty said, and this is going back to the question about that Debbie asked about Vladimir. He said that Vladimir was the equivalent to the name William, or that's what he was told.
Well, frankly, it's just a name, and it is irrelevant what it means. It's just
I had it from Becky's Russian grandfather.
Right, but it's really just a very Russian-sounding name, and there were good reasons for Jews to want to not have Jewish names.
And sometimes by law, they were required to have what they called a civil name. At least that was true in Poland. My Aunt Rivka was known as Regina. So it wasn't
from. I heard Rivka was Rebecca.
I think it could be that as well. And there's the R, using the same letter, the first letter, to pick something that sounds familiar. Ava added for Stanley that there is a course on Jewish Gen. It's intermediate DNA that can explain some additional tools that could help you narrow down those relationships. So you might want to take a look at that as well.
And then you're mentioning the Moscow, the U.S. story about where Jewish genealogy was helped identify. I can send you a copy of that article if anybody is interested, because it was absolutely fascinating. It was in New York Times yesterday.
Yeah. You could put it in chat right now if you want, or send it to me and I'll put it out in the next newsletter, because it was a really interesting story. Really interesting.
Good.
Okay.
Aaron,
Go ahead, Barbara.
I have a question for Aaron. When I have found family trees that have been posted by folks in Israel or in Europe, they don't list the family members who immigrated to the United States before 1921. It's as if they've fallen off the face of the earth. Of course, I couldn't list my grandmother's siblings because I didn't even know their names. And so finding these families is just amazing. In one case, I found a Yaskin relative, that's a family name I searched, who were from Zlobin, which is not far from Rogachev. And there was one brother who went to Mexico. And I couldn't believe it. I never thought of Jews going to Mexico around 1910. And one cousin in the United States remembered that his mother had a fur coat with a label that said Mexico City, DF. And that they were in the fur business, and that she must have gotten that coat from this cousin. So these tiny little hints can be so helpful. But it's weird how the trees don't list the people who came to the US.
Well, it probably represents just a lack of knowledge, but I would say a lot of people don't know much about their family.
When I met Lena, she said she knew that Sarah, her grandmother's sister, had gone to Philadelphia and had married someone named Ben. But in the late 80s, they had no idea of how to find that family. And in fact, my grandmother had died before that. But today, I think it would be a lot easier for them to find Sarah's family. And
well,
and
everything,
make
you know, all the census records are online. And I use obituaries are very helpful also.
Yeah.
It's a shame that people aren't spending the money to do obituaries anymore. I've been noticing that, you know, because newspapers charge a lot of money because they're not getting revenue for anywhere else. So you have to think about it in terms of economics if you're going to actually go to the trouble of having an obituary anywhere. I was looking at our friend Roxanne's obituary, which is only online, and it was quite extensive with a lot of pictures, and it was just lovely. I just thought years from now, if anybody's looking for information about Roxanne, they're going to get a lot of information. But I've also had friends who've decided not to put anything in any media. So that's kind of discouraging. I wanted to ask Aaron, he said that he had been to Ukraine recently, and I know Mike has ancestry in Ukraine. My brother-in-law does. How many of you have ancestors in Ukraine or families you're researching? Anybody? Oh, we have quite a few. So Aaron, I don't know where you disappeared, if you went back to Egypt. Would you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine, not necessarily from the aspect of the war, but just in terms of records and research and genealogy? Aaron, are you still there? He might have wandered into cyberspace or taken a break, quite possibly. We'll see. Who else would like to ask a question of Aaron when and if he returns? Or make perhaps another observation or question? There he is. Aaron, we were wondering.
Pit stop.
Okay, I thought so. I wanted to ask you just to comment briefly, because we don't want to keep you. We have about 5 or 6 people on screen who are doing research on Ukraine, who have roots there or doing some other research. You've been there recently. Could you just comment about your experience in Ukraine, not necessarily about the war that's going on there, but just what else you've discovered in terms of genealogical resources or other information that you think Ukraine researchers would find helpful?
Yes, well, by the way, when I go on major trips, and I've been to, I think I'm up to 8 times in Ukraine and 5 or 6 times in Belarus. Sometimes people sponsor the guide for a day, and I visit their shtetls because this is a trip that most people won't make. So I've been in Ukraine 3 times since the war started, and I visit a lot of shtetls on people's behalf, just to see what there was to see. I think the most important thing if you're researching Ukraine, is to be aware that Alex Krakowski has gone to Ukrainian archives for a few years, and I'm not sure whether it's 3 or 4 years, asking to scan their records. And Ukraine has a national archive, but it has actually a regional archive system. So if they say no, he takes them to court and he always wins. So this represents millions of records, which Jewish Gen, under the leadership of Gary Pokrasa, is translating and getting online. They're actually all, the original documents are all online. There's a wiki that has them, an index to it. It's in Ukrainian, but you can look at it through translation. I should also mention that the Ukraine archives in Kiev has a lot of online documents, so you can find them through translation. So then, what do you do if you find a document that hasn't been translated? It's, in fact, there are many letters in the Russian alphabet that are similar to English or Greek. And if you're looking for a last name, you only have to know how to spell your own last name in a written document. So it's actually possible to go through documents from that are not indexed, only in a file, that are written in Russian, which is what they would have used, and to find your last name, because you don't really need to even be able to read Cyrillic. And then you can when you find something, you can have somebody translate it. So Jewish Gen is gradually catching up. So even if you looked on Jewish Gen a year ago or a month ago, keep looking, because they keep turning up. They're listed separately. So for example, when you get a hit on a revision list for this new group, they're called revision list 2. So that's the most important thing that you should know.
Aaron, when you've gone into these shtetls in the last couple of years, these little Jewish towns, other than documents, well, I guess in addition to any documents that you might find in this town, what might you likely learn by going to the shtetl versus doing everything?
Well, I never look for documents, because I consider that's something that a professional can do, or a lot of it can be done without going anywhere. So I never look for documents. If I get any, that would just be luck. Well, for one thing, you can catch the vibe. The Soviet Union, after communism took over, the Soviet Union, this big country, became a rather depressed place. So there's a tremendous number of pre-revolutionary buildings that exist. Or if it's in certain parts of Ukraine that were in Poland, they would be pre-World War II buildings. So if you go to Lviv, for example, and you walk around Lviv today, the central part of Lviv bears a tremendous amount of resemblance to what it looked into 1938. This can extend to the village level, where the main street might have a lot of Soviet-era buildings, but the side streets still have original buildings from even from before World War I. So that's one thing. Many towns have Jewish cemeteries in different states of repair. In some cemeteries, we're talking both Ukraine and Belarus, and Poland also, there are almost no standing stones. In other cases, there are thousands of standing stones, such as, say, the Third Jewish Cemetery in Odessa, and I was there in September. So many cemeteries are overgrown, and there were significant Jewish communities in Ukraine, I believe, and in Belarus until the breakup of the Soviet Union. And then many of the Jews left at that time because they didn't understand they thought the door would be closed again, because in the past, the Soviet Union opened the door when it wanted something and then closed it. So many of the Jews at that time piled out, whether they wanted to or not. And since then, many of the remaining Jews have left. So many cemeteries were still active after World War II, but have gradually been abandoned. So I saw many just in the last year that had been abandoned within the last 10 years. But it's like here, if you abandon something, it's very soon overtaken with the jungle.
I wanted to just share with everybody, if you wanted to know if your shtetl had a cemetery, you can go to an IAJGS site, and they have been accumulating the names of cemeteries. If there is a caretaker, very often, as you were pointing out, Aaron, the caretakers are not there anymore. Sometimes there's information about the condition of the cemetery. There might even have been some kind of a survey. And in some cases, somebody went there and collected pictures of all of the tombstones, and they're in a database. So you might want to check this site out if you haven't been there before. So in addition to, as you say, getting the vibe, there may be some physical structures, cemeteries, buildings of interest.
But there's another angle to cemeteries, though.
Okay.
Jews didn't, if the cemetery was destroyed, and the Soviet Union passed a law about 1965 that if property was abandoned, the government could take it over, which affected many cemeteries, not just Jewish ones. But if a cemetery was destroyed and there were still Jews in town, what happened? They used a regular cemetery, but a lot of the Jewish graves are in the same section. And that's not going to be on the JWBR, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually another place where you could find Jewish graves in a non-Jewish cemetery.
Aaron,
Yes.
what does the State Department say about travel to Ukraine? When you went to Kiev in September, I mean, that was kind of brave.
I went for the first time during the war a year ago in May. So the State Department said, don't go. By that time, I already had like 20 or 30 contacts in Ukraine from 7 trips. Not relatives, just contacts, guides, and other people that helped me. So most of the people I announced that I was thinking of going, and most of the people I told in Ukraine said, don't come also. But anyways, I decided I was going. So once I booked the ticket in May, I told the people I was coming. So the same people that said, don't come, said, we're waiting for you. And one of them, a guide, offered me a free apartment to stay in Chortkiv, Ukraine, which was, so I knew then that I made the right decision, actually.
Wow.
The amazing thing is you made it back without a scratch, I assume.
Well, I was
scratches.
more worried, I guess, especially for the initial visit, I was more worried about COVID.
Okay.
In fact, once I made sure people know where I was from, so they would immediately hug me and thank me as if I was America.
All right. Would anybody else like to add an observation or perhaps ask a question of Aaron? It's almost 3 o'clock, and I wanted to leave just a little bit of time for anybody who maybe has a brick wall, especially since Aaron is here and he seems to be very good at breaking those down. Well, Barbara, do you want to add your appreciation to Aaron for showing
Aaron,
up?
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I think ever since I was in confirmation class when I was 15 years old, I had a dream that I would find one surviving sibling of my grandmother's, and then it took me till 2017 to find many, many more. And I think a lot of us have that dream of finding family that survived the Holocaust. And or even if they didn't survive, to find out what happened to them. And you've given us so many good examples, and like Debbie said, sometimes it's the old-fashioned way, and maybe that's part of the answer to our search. But thank you very much for such an interesting talk.
Thank you.
And stick around for just a couple of minutes. Aaron, would anybody like to put a more personal question out there, perhaps something you've been working on, a struggle to make a connection or find a resource? Because Aaron seems to be particularly adept at doing that.
I consider my specialty is looking at a family tree and figure out what nobody else did.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to find something if nobody found anything.
Yeah.
I hired somebody in Belarus to research some documents on one of my great-grandfathers, because I just could not find anything about him. And he was kind of famous because he was married twice, and he had children until he was almost 80 years old. And I felt sure that somebody could find something about him. So I sent him the money last January, and he told me it would take several months, and I haven't heard anything. Do you know what the situation is in Belarus as far as personal freedom and people's ability to travel? He said he would have to go to Minsk.
The question is, does he live in Belarus? The question I would ask you is, does the person actually live in Belarus?
Yes, he does.
Well, I think you do, the person, well, we know it's a dictatorship, and I can't comment on that specifically, but I can tell you that I remember I found out about COVID there from a contact in Israel, and the president was in denial. So they denied they had COVID for a long time, which might sound familiar in the United States. So most of the victims of COVID died from something else there. The public schools were only closed briefly, and although I don't know it for a fact, I'm most probably the teacher that I know that died from COVID probably caught it in school. By looking at their Facebook posting, by looking at their Facebook postings, I was able to tell that some of my relatives and most of my guides and people I met were opponents of the regime, which is a very dangerous thing to do. One of the guides didn't really want to demonstrate because she was pregnant and had a young child, but she went to one demonstration, which was a demonstration of tourist guides. The young man Castus, that among other things, handed me voter registration lists that he copied from a Ukraine archives from the 1930s, when it was Poland, which are incredibly invaluable. Real voter registration lists from an election. He was not shy about his position about the government on Facebook. So he was summoned to meet with the secret police, which is much bigger than the army there, which is still called the KGB, when they were investigating somebody else. And eventually he fled to Poland. Another person I met who was a guide was beaten up and left. Somebody that I had for a translator in 2008 was beaten up and left, and that was a bus driver in Colorado. And politically, it's a nightmare. One of my contacts in Israel warned me not to go, because if I brought money, they'd be suspicious that I was giving money to people in the opposition, which is almost impossible not to do because more than half the country is in the opposition.
I guess, Barbara, that means it might take you a couple more months to hear from your
researcher.
So. You don't think about looking at records being dangerous, but we're not in that part of the world.
Yeah, and
well, I mean, the important thing is your person communicating with you. That's something.
I think the main thing is that Belarus is a puppet state of Russia's, and they're probably much more constrained in traveling and communicating.
But do you know if he's alive?
Haven't heard from him lately.
I mean, he
Uh,
could have been one of those people that died from COVID.
You
Right.
can travel within the country.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
All right. I don't see or hear any other questions. So if it's all right with everybody, I'm going to go ahead and call it. We are sending out our copies of Michigas, thanks to Ava and Mike and others who helped me put it together and edit it. And of course, the next big thing will be our August meeting. I'll have more details for you a little bit later after I recover from this round of continuing education for real estate agents. I have to put that to bed and then I can focus on TJGS. I hope all of you are staying well. I hope all that we'll be able to see each other on August 6th. I hope you'll hold that date for us because we haven't been together for 2.5 years. And I know that Barbara and I have been chatting about that. It's really important to maintain that personal touch. So enjoy the beginning of your summer. Thank you, Ava. I know you've been taking copious notes. I've been watching you as we go. And Aaron, thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your experiences with us. Good researching, everybody.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Take care. Be well.
So long, y'all.
Take care now. Bye-bye.